Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 24 and 25. So let's begin. Mrs. Shuyona fought the urge to shiver at the figure that sat across her desk. He gave every evidence of being pleasant, but she just couldn't shake the feeling that he could snap her without even leaving the chair on the other side of her desk. He was dressed in a plain black suit, but he wore it in such a way that it seemed natural. She'd seen many men in suits, and even for those who wore them every day, there was often an air of discomfort. This man didn't show that. And she could tell that the suit was tailored. Specifically tailored to him. That meant money. He had white hair, and a friendly grin, and had been polite to her staff. The school's secretary had been practically drooling. But none of that changed the feeling she had. She did not want to be here. "I'm afraid I find your proposed punishment manifestly inadequate," he said smoothly. "What punishments?" Shuyona wanted to ask. She hadn't assigned any yet. And the incident was, well, what did you do when a quirkless boy deliberately riles up others? It was hardly their fault, and while they had been a bit exuberant in their discussion, the boy should really know that it was best for him to keep silent. They were just teaching him that, since it appeared detention with Rika had not done that. Nor had the detentions with Samai. "I expect them to be representative of the crime," the man before her was saying. "I think we can be reasonable here," Mrs. Shuyona said. Given the nature of the incident, she had to speak with the parents of all those involved. Mr. Hisashi Rigi had gotten the first appointment. He'd actually made the arrangements with her secretary. Kenta Abe, Zakuro Kitagawa and Asushi Ueno's parents had yet to confirm their appointments. The sentence earned her a half-smile from him. It was not reassuring. "Oh, I think you will find I am a very reasonable man. Your son has been a troublemaker at this school since he arrived." Mrs. Shuyona responded. She knew Mr. Rigi was the head of JBQC, but that didn't mean anything here. He has several marks on his permanent record, and simply does not behave as he should. It was amazing how much information could be given by the simple shifting of facial features. Shuyona could see mocking amusement on his face, and for a moment she felt utter fear before she calmed herself. There was nothing to fear. And how should my son behave? The question didn't even carry a note of challenge. It was asked as if he was seeking idle information. "He is quirkless," Principal Shuyona said mildly. "It would be best for him to be." She paused, considering her words. She wanted to say, "seen but not heard," except that wasn't right. No one wanted to see him either. "Quiet," Shuyona finished. It was rather incongruous to see him sit back, as if this was his office. "You may rest assured, he will be quiet next year, as I will be enrolling my son in a different institution." That was a shock. He'd only been enrolled this year. "We would be happy to facilitate that," Shuyona indicated. "I'm glad to hear that, as his enrollment will be at your expense." "No, it will not." She didn't even have to think about that response. "Yes, it will," he said. "Because that is my price for not taking legal action." At that, she had to resist an urge to laugh. The unease she had been feeling earlier evaporated. "Mr. Rigi," Shuyona said, "I realize you are a reasonably wealthy man, but bringing legal action for this would simply be a waste of your time and money. There would be no conviction." While her school had never suffered legal action, others had for similar incidents, and the punishments were very reasonable. "And I assure you, that any charges I chose to press, will stick. To you, to the school, to those involved," Mr. Rigi told her with a smile. There was not a trace of doubt in his voice. Shuyona snorted as she wondered why she'd been afraid. "They are 7. You won't be able to press charges against the children. I think you underestimate what I can do," he replied, still completely self-assured. Before she could answer, Shuyona was interrupted by her phone. It wasn't the one on her desk, that was used for school business. It was her personal phone. "You'll want to answer that," Hisashi Rigi commented. His amusement was back. She glared at him but picked up the phone, ignoring how rude it was. She didn't recognize the number but stabbed accept on the vid call anyway. "Hello?" Shuyona said before the image cleared. "Principal Shuyona?" came the immediate question. She almost couldn't answer. On screen was the Minister of Education Koichi Hyuda. The fear Shuyona had managed to control came back in full. Hisashi Rigi gave her one of those smiles that told her wordlessly that he held all the cards. She managed to nod. "What the hell are you thinking, allowing an assault on a student?" the minister yelled. Any thought Shuyona might have had about keeping the conversation private went out the window, but Mr. Rigi had definitely implied he knew who was going to call. With respect, sir, the student in question has several marks on his record. She tried to defend herself, though she knew it wouldn't work. The minister didn't look convinced. I'm aware of that, he told her, holding up a file. Did you really think you'd get away with these? He asked. He sounded disgusted. Minister Hayuda was shaking his head. Covering up the crimes of your delinquent students by shifting the blame to another will not be tolerated. These will be expunged. But he's disruptive in class. Shuyona objected. Ah, yes, the minister said, and she could tell he was mocking her. The supposed trigger for this, the minister paused. He looked uncomfortable. Episode, he concluded. Did you even think about the implications, or did you and your teachers just object to being shown up by a 7-year-old? Frankly, if a child is reading the Journal of Experimental Biology when they're 7, then I would be checking for an intelligence quirk. And if they don't have one, then accept that they are smarter than all of us. And nurture that intelligence. But no. What did you do? The minister snarled. There was real anger in his voice. Hisashi Rigi's expression didn't change, even as Shuyona felt sicker inside with every word from the minister. He still looked smugly assured. Your idiot teacher belittles him, and then puts him in detention. And then to compound the problem, they do not even make sure a 7-year-old makes it out of the school safely. This has led to a broken rib, extensive bruising and who knows what other trauma. I'm also informed that a large amount of Hisashi's son's property has been stolen over the year and nothing has been done. You will give Hisashi Rigi whatever he wants to make this go away. And you will consider whatever he wants cheap. Shuyona got the impression that the minister wanted to slam the phone down, but he didn't. Instead, he was breathing hard after that tirade. Am I understood? He asked savagely. She managed to swallow and nodded shallowly. He glared a few moments longer before he hung up. Before Shuyona could say anything to Hisashi Rigi, who hadn't moved, another ringtone echoed through her office. You don't mind, do you? Hisashi asked, as he pulled out his phone. Shuyona was still shocked over what had just happened. She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak just yet. Principal Shuyona watched as Hisashi held the phone out and then tapped accept. Koichi, it's good to hear from you, he greeted the caller. It was then that Shuyona knew how outmaneuvered she was. I just wish it was under better circumstances, the minister said. Shuyona wanted to interrupt. She wanted to tell them that she understood, but the fear was back. It wasn't just doubled. It was almost a tangible thing. She could feel it coiling around her and didn't know what to do. Troubling times, Hisashi replied. She couldn't see the image of the minister clearly, but she thought she saw him nod. Have your man send me a copy of whatever you want, the minister said. I'll make sure it goes through. It won't be too onerous, Hisashi said. I know. You are far too forgiving, Koichi responded. Let me know if you want any changes. I will. Thank you, Koichi. You're more than welcome. Hisashi. You know that, the minister replied. Hisashi nodded and the conversation ended and the white-haired man looked back at her. He was still smiling. I trust that clears up my credentials? He asked, and Shuyona didn't have to imagine the superior note in his voice. What do you want? She asked, remembering the minister had asked for a copy. That meant that Hisashi must have discussed the entire case with the minister, including what he wanted for retribution. She couldn't say anything when he seemed to savor his victory. As Koichi indicated, you will erase the marks on Izuku's permanent record and you will allow no others to enter it, he told her. You will also make sure that no one touches my son again. That sentence was growled at her and Shuyona could tell Hisashi's teeth were clenched. She thought that wasn't what he wanted. She rather thought he wanted to have them in her throat. Shuyona nodded. That seemed simple enough, but it seemed too easy, even if they had to pay tuition. I do not expect you to change your teacher's attitudes towards Izuku. In fact, I suspect if they did, it would be confusing to him, so do not try that. She nodded. For those children involved in this unfortunate event, I do expect appropriate notes made on their permanent records, the same as I do for others I know you have been covering for. Again, Shuyona nodded. Hisashi Rigi didn't need to say that he would be checking. She knew that would happen. He was silent for a few moments, waiting for her to speak, and she realized that the main part had yet to be addressed. Which school will be enrolling Izuku in? His face became thoughtful. I have not yet decided. She nodded again and then took a deep breath, bracing herself. It will not change, Principal Shuyona told him softly. Hisashi cocked his head slightly, his white hair falling down to half cover his eyes. It will not change anything, Shuyona repeated. All you are doing is moving the problem, she explained. He's still going to be quirkless. Izuku's father gave her a smile. She wasn't sure if it was condescending or not. It was odd. Shuyona couldn't read it. Izuku has faith, Hisashi said slowly, and she could tell he understood her point. Izuku has faith in humanity to be better than we are, he explained. She couldn't help the disbelieving look. It was one thing for someone normal to have such a thought, but for a quirkless child? They were far better off learning to be quiet, and to take what they could get. Hisashi Rigi might think he was doing right by his child, but he was being cruel. The sooner Izuku learned, the better, but he seemed intent on indulging his son. She sighed, allowing him to see it. The world will not be kind to Izuku. At that, Hisashi Rigi gave her a distinctly superior smile. I think you will find it will be kinder than you believe. For a moment, she didn't understand, and then her mind recalled the journal entry that had started this. You believe that research? There were too many ifs with that research. If you believed that quirks were unstable. If you believed in quirk singularity. If you believed. You had to believe in a lot. Quirk singularity wasn't a new theory, and sure, there were quirks that were becoming more and more powerful, but there were others which were just barely quirks. The quirkless were a step below. That research was a dream, probably written by a quirkless sympathizer. She hadn't bothered to make inquiries about the author. The online response to the paper spoke for themselves. No one was taking it seriously. While many quirks are coming into their own. With each successive generation, more and more quirks are becoming unstable, Hisashi informed her. The research does not. He held up one hand. We will see, he interrupted but offered no further explanation. I have faith in Izuku's ability to adapt, Hisashi Rigi said as he rose. Shuyona shook her head, and then the cold feeling she had gotten from him came back, redoubled. It is no longer your concern, he told her deliberately, and she knew she'd been dismissed. She said nothing as he left, and it was only after he was gone did she shiver. Principal Shuyona didn't want to meet Hisashi Rigi ever again. All for One knocked on Izuku's door before he pushed it open. His son was lying face down on his stomach with his head cradled in his hands. He could smell the salt of tears. This should have been a fun day for Izuku, despite the pain from his rib, since Hisashi had allowed him to take the day off. But here he was crying, not watching hero fights, which was a win to All for One, but worrying in other ways. My little dragon, he said softly. Izuku didn't look up, but from the movement Hisashi knew he was aware of his presence. He let himself into the room and moved to sit on the bed. Izuku shifted and Hisashi held him close. You will be going to a new school next year, Izuku, he crooned. For a few moments, he didn't think his son had heard, then he stiffened slightly but didn't stop crying. But why? Izuku eventually cried to him. Hisashi didn't answer immediately. Instead he rubbed Izuku's back, making sure his hands were warm. I knew, when I told you not to use your quirk, that it would be difficult for you, Izuku. I knew there would be some danger. People are cruel, Izuku. Children reflect adults, and while I knew there would be some pain, I didn't know it would be this bad. That was mostly true actually. He thought this would have occurred far earlier in the year. But why? Izuku repeated. People fear what they do not understand. Which is why the heroes raided us. Yes. That's why the heroes raided us. Because they were afraid, they tried to hurt me. Your classmates are afraid of you, Izuku. What are they afraid of? You are different, Izuku. Your classmates aren't nice because you are different. And because you are perceived as weak. Heroes are the same, Izuku. They do not protect the weak, they protect themselves. Heroes are better, Izuku objected. They were still on that argument. No, they aren't, Izuku. I wish they were, but they aren't. But I wouldn't. I know, my little dragon. I know. You are not afraid, but you are different. You are special. You are precious. You are better than them, and I will not let them hurt you again, he added fiercely. They aren't all bad, Izuku said. I know, my little dragon. I know, but most are. And I will show you. Izuku said nothing. All for One thought that he might want to, but the reality of his broken rib cut through many arguments. Over the summer, Izuku would learn the truth about heroes, and then next year, any lingering doubt would be removed. Hisashi crooned softly as Izuku cried himself to sleep. Tomura already saw things his way, but Izuku was stubborn. Yet the work done now would be more than paid off when Izuku stood by his side. He just had to have a little patience. You're really going to a new school? Himiko's golden eyes were wide. Izuku's green eyes were wobbly with tears that were streaming down his face. He nodded. Is it because of your rib? She asked, gesturing towards his chest. Yes, Izuku told her. His dad had made the decision just after that. I'm going to miss you, he cried. He still missed Minato and Okeko, so he knew what it was like. And he wasn't even sure if he could see them this summer for his birthday because his dad hadn't decided where they would be living yet. Himiko's face settling into an expression of sadness. Even her hair buns appeared to be down. Usually the messy strands that escaped gave the impression of playfulness, but now they were subdued. Me too, she agreed. What about your birthday? She asked. I don't know, Izuku told her. You're moving? House, as well as school. Himiko corrected. He nodded. Dad moves around a lot for work, he explained. I don't know when we are moving this time. She nodded slowly. So this is your last day? Yes, Izuku said, not wanting to agree. Himiko's expression became thoughtful. Can I taste you? Izuku hadn't been expecting that. His confusion showed on his face. For my quirk. Oh. Even with the sadness he felt, he couldn't help but feel slightly excited about that. Himiko had told him about her quirk, but he'd never seen it demonstrated. What do you need? How do we do this? Do we need a needle, or a knife? Izuku didn't like the idea of bleeding, but the opportunity to see Himiko's quirk put a different spin on the matter. No, I'll do it. Himiko seemed buoyed by the opportunity as well. She grinned at him, and for the first time Izuku noticed how sharp her canines were. She grabbed his hand, and before Izuku could object, it was dragged towards her mouth. He felt a sharp stab of pain in his forefinger. Himiko's mouth was warm. He felt her tongue lick at his finger before she pulled back and lowered his hand. Himiko swallowed. Yummy. Izuku watched as she actually closed her eyes and quivered. He wondered if that was part of her quirk or something else. While he didn't like the taste of blood, if Himiko's quirk was dependent on it, it would make sense she would. But could she get sick from it? If someone had a disease, could she catch it from the blood? Himiko's gold eyes opened and she smiled at him. You taste good, Izuku. She told him. That's your quirk, he told her. All blood tastes good, right? Yep. She nodded and Izuku watched as she seemed to melt. Her clothes remained the same, but her hair darkened and curled into the mess that was his hair. Her eyes changed, until they were bright green. She became a bit shorter too. Doesn't that hurt? Izuku asked. His broken rib had hurt. It wasn't what he'd call a blinding pain, but it had been there all the time. From the looks of things, Himiko's bones were shifting as she changed into him. It didn't take long before he was looking at a perfect image of himself. Except, dressed in Himiko's uniform. He didn't think he looked good in a dress. It doesn't hurt, she told him. But you do taste good. Better than others. Izuku gave her a smile at that. I'll remember it. Himiko even sounded like him. You can remember different blood? Izuku asked. His fingers were twitching. He wanted to add this to Himiko's page in his notebook. Of course I can. She gave him a big grin. It looked odd on his face, but Izuku could see Himiko even if she was wearing his form. I always remember the blood of the ones I love. Izuku blushed and Himiko laughed. Izu. She chirped, and even in the shortening of his name he could hear her returned sadness. I'm going to really, really miss you. He sniffed. He didn't need the reminder. I will too, he replied. I really, really will. He swallowed against the tears he could feel forming in his eyes. Himiko shifted back into her own form, and suddenly Izuku was pulled into a hug. We'll always be friends, right, Izuku? Promise me. That was the easiest thing in the world to promise. Always. Izuku said. Good. They held each other for a few moments longer before they had to pull back. I promise, Izuku repeated. I know. That was enough. Happy birthday, my little dragon. Hisashi greeted his son. Izuku gave him a giant grin and ran over for a hug. Hisashi was happy to comply. This was another birthday Izuku would spend without his friends. They had moved from Niigata down to Saitama. The living arrangement was slightly different this time. There was, of course, a bar for Kurogiri, but instead of having rooms at the back for them to live in, there was a large apartment in the building above. He'd already had Kurogiri take the children out to see the sights of Tokyo. He was thankful Izuku was so accepting, but All for One knew that for proper socialization, he'd have to make sure that Izuku got to experience having other children over. His 6th birthday didn't really count. His son would probably not remember that. He remembered it now, but when he was older, he'd only remember that childhood was good. But the experiences had to be built upon. "What do you want for breakfast?" he asked. Izuku looked at him, confused. "I can cook, you know," Hisashi told his son with a snort of laughter. He was not a great chef, but he could cook something that would please his son. "Muffins!" Izuku yelled. He'd expected pancakes, but Hisashi figured he could handle muffins. "What type?" he asked for clarification. "Chocolate chip. I think I can manage that," All for One told his son as they walked to the kitchen. He'd asked Kurogiri to get a variety of ingredients for today so he could make whatever Izuku wanted, and the Misty Man had taken Tomura out for the day already. The teen had gone with minimal grumbling. He'd spent the day with Tomura on his birthday, so the teen knew better than to complain. "I've got presents for you after breakfast," Hisashi told his son, as he sat Izuku down at the table. "Presents?" Izuku's eyes went wide with happiness. It might be his birthday, but what he loved the most about it was that he got to spend the entire day with his dad. Presents were just a bonus. "Yes, presents. 2 of them," All for One said as he levitated the cooking book to Izuku, open to the page with choc chip muffins on it. "Read me the ingredients?" he asked. Izuku grinned at him and then pulled the book close. He looked at the ingredients. He recognized some of the kanji and those he didn't had hiragana on them. He began reading. As Izuku named each ingredient, Hisashi levitated it from the cupboard or the fridge, as required. He'd already put the oven on so that it would be preheated when the batter was mixed. Izuku watched with wide happy eyes as he demonstrated his levitation quirk. "This is one of my quirks. My little dragon. Is it lick?" Izuku stopped the sentence. Hisashi knew where he was going. "It's not like your mother's quirk," he said, not mentioning how Izuku had paused, but he was pleased. "Your mother's quirk simply brought things to her. This one lets me do more," he demonstrated by pushing the packet of chocolate chips towards his son. Then he pulled it back and made it dance in the air. It was good practice for him to work on his fine control. Izuku watched as he mixed the ingredients together. "Daddy, where do you get your quirks from?" he asked finally. All for One had been expecting this question for a while. With everything that had happened, though, he rather thought that Izuku had been distracted from asking him. "I get them from people, Izuku," he said, unconcerned with the answer. "But people don't like having their quirk taken," Izuku objected, with a note of worry in his voice. Izuku knew that people wouldn't like having their quirk taken. He'd learned that with Tomura. "I still get them from people," Hisashi repeated. "Sometimes people don't like their quirk, or can't control their quirk," he began explaining. "I help them out by taking their quirk." He saw Izuku's green curls nod at the explanation and he waited for the obvious objection. "But then they'd be quirkless," the new 8-year-old realized. Hisashi looked at his son and nodded. "That's one of the reasons I was so upset with what happened to you. Society doesn't understand that sometimes. Those who give up their quirk have done it for the good of everyone, especially if they can't control it." Izuku's expression became thoughtful. Hisashi knew his son was wavering with his thoughts on heroes, and by the end of a day he planned on having that waver to be full waver doubt. "Some of those who can't control their quirks are quite old," he added. He focused mostly on the younger generation now when he was seeking a quirk because they were more developed. The older generation tended to have less developed quirks. But with Izuku's ability to merge quirks, his son could potentially make use of many partial quirks to make one very powerful ability. And, taking a quirk from an older person, who wouldn't miss it as much, would be a good way of easing Izuku into the thought of taking them. That wouldn't be for a few years, but it was best to start the seed of those thoughts early. He put the muffins in the oven and set the timer before he came back to sit with Izuku. "Now, for the first of your presents," he announced. That perked Izuku right up, breaking him out of the thoughts of how he got the quirks. And what better way to have him even further distracted than by giving him another quirk? Reach out, Hisashi instructed. Green eyes became huge but Izuku complied. Hisashi held out 2 quirks. One was orange and the other was a color that simply couldn't be described. Both? Izuku asked uncertainly. Both, Hisashi confirmed. If anything, Izuku's eyes went wider but All for One felt his son gently take the offered quirks. He actually shivered with delight when they settled in him. What do they do? Izuku asked sensibly. It was far better for him to ask than to randomly try out the quirks. The orange one is fireproofing, he told his son. Fireproofing was a passive quirk. It was active all the time, which was good because Izuku would be able to use fire breath without fear of injuring himself from now on. That quirk came with an implied heat-proofing too. Really? Izuku gasped. Really, Hisashi grinned. The other one is something else. The quirk is named Kilo, he said. He'd taken it from a stupid model who liked to brag that she didn't weigh more than 60 pounds, which frankly, even for a stick-thin woman was a ridiculous weight. She was using her quirk to lighten her body. But that was only half her quirk. She could also make herself heavier. Not that the idiot ever did. Izuku would have far more use for the quirk. As a dragon, he could be light enough to fly but heavy enough to guard his treasure. There was another aspect of Kilo that Hisashi had deliberately held back from testing to let Izuku discover it. There did seem to be a certain level of imperviousness that came with the quirk. The model had kept her weight low, but that usually meant weaker, yet she never seemed to have any scratches or scrapes. He was curious to know that if Izuku made himself heavier, if that meant he'd be physically tougher. If so, well, that was definitely keeping with the dragon theme. This is why he loved quirks. By combining just the right ones you could achieve so much. Izuku didn't have that many. Just these 4 now, plus his original, and Hisashi could already see his potential. All for One watched with his quirk as his son poked at the quirk. He got the distinct impression that the quirk wasn't sure what to do and he chuckled. Izuku wasn't distracted though. He kept probing at the quirk and Hisashi saw the moment that Izuku activated it. The quirk flared and then spread out over Izuku's body. He looked at this son. Izuku was looking at his hand with a thoughtful expression. Even his freckles looked thoughtful. He waved his hand back and forth, trying to work out what the quirk was doing. All for One held out his hand and Izuku took it. Izuku had made himself lighter. That was probably what the quirk was more familiar with. Lift yourself with Kali Imperium, he instructed. Green eyes were startled but Izuku obeyed and then a delighted smile spread across his features as he rose into the air. He stopped quickly and resettled onto the chair. Don't try the other one yet, Hisashi warned. We'll go to the practice room later. He added. Izuku grinned at that. Thank you, Daddy. Hisashi got up to check the muffins. That was only your first present, he said, taking the tray out of the oven. Izuku looked like he was about to burst from happiness and for a few moments, there was silence in the kitchen before Izuku composed himself enough to ask. What's my other present? After lunch, Hisashi said, bringing over a plate of steaming muffins. You'll get it after lunch. Izuku grabbed for one and then paused. Give it a go, he encouraged. The little hand reached out and tentatively touched the hot muffin. They were cooling down quickly but Izuku's face lit up with delight as he handled the hot muffin. Yummy. He took a bite from it. And no burned mouth? No-uth. Came Izuku's rather garbled reply as he chewed on the muffin. Excellent. Hisashi chuckled. Now, at your new school, you will be saying that your quirk makes you fireproof. Izuku dramatically swallowed his bite of muffin. Why do I have to do that, Daddy? All for One allowed himself to look sad. I wish you could tell the world what your quirk is, Izuku, I really do. But if you do, then the bad people will find you, and they'll find me. Green eyes went impossibly wide at that. I don't want that to happen. Izuku announced. I know you don't, Hisashi said calmly. That's why you will have a different surname again. Izuku looked subdued. That's what I'm working on, Izuku. I want you to be able to tell the world about your quirk. I want people to be seen for who they are, so that they don't want to be afraid. Daddy is helping people? Izuku asked, fascinated. That was one way of looking at it. I try, All for One replied. Now, enough of that talk, and more muffins. Muffins! Izuku shrieked, easily distracted. Hisashi smiled indulgently as Izuku had another muffin. Things were going well. End chapters 24 and 25. The Empress Dragon, Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.